Okay, who does not have the handout for 1 Samuel chapter 8? If you do not have this handout, raise your hand. 1. Chapter 8 and combine 9 and 10. Okay.
No, I got 8.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this is the one I handed out last Sunday, so. Alright.
I was working again.
You were working, well, hey, it's good to work ahead. Yeah, you are, by all means, work ahead. Hey, that's a compelling story. I'll give that. And it really helps. We're covering this a chapter at a time in class, but it really helps when you read the narrative in as large a chunk as possible. You start seeing connections. You start seeing how the story unfolds. You start seeing that, this is one story. It's not 31 stories strung together in 31 chapters. It's one story that God is telling, really a part of a larger story that God is telling in the whole Bible. All right, well, in just kind of recalling the overall outline of Samuel, well, the first 7 chapters are about Samuel and his work as a judge over Israel. Chapters 8 through 15 are about the beginning of Saul's reign and his successes and his failures. And then chapter 16 onwards begins this conflict between Saul and the house of David. Well, here in chapter 8, we kind of have a turning point. Now, if you look in the end of chapter 7, it says Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He used to go annually on circuit to Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. And then his return was to Ramah, for his house was there, and there he judged Israel, and he built an altar to the Lord. Now, with all the good things that happened in chapter 7, that would be a good way to end the book. Be a good end to the story, with Israel restored to God, and the Philistines defeated, and the prophet regularly judging the nation. But that's not the end of the story, unfortunately, and things kind of take a turn for the not-so-good in chapter 8. Israel becomes very quickly discontent with this setup, and of course, Samuel is not going to live forever. He's mortal. He's afflicted, like all of us, with the curse of the fall. And so, and the Philistines are not permanently gone. The stage is set for the establishment of Israel's monarchy, and this chapter begins that transition. So, we'll start, first of all, with the setting. Can somebody read the first 3 verses of chapter 8?
And it came about when Samuel was old. Now the name of his first one was Joel. The second was his sons, however, did not walk. Died after the
Okay. Now, where have we seen this before? Samuel's sons. What would you say about that? They weren't as bad as Eli's sons. Well, yes and no. I mean, Eli's sons, they perverted the office of a priest. Samuel's sons, they pervert. Yeah, that's true. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't want to put sliding scale on the different kinds of sins. Yeah, really.
Like James 2.
Har. Yes, Samuel's sons. They're not like Samuel. They take bribes. They pervert justice. They do things that are contrary to their office. This violates what the office of a judge is all about. In Deuteronomy chapter 16, in verses 18 through 20, God says, "You shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in all your towns which the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice, nor shall you be partial, and you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Justice, and only justice, you shall pursue, that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you." Samuel's sons do not live up to that. They take bribes. They do the opposite of what a judge is supposed to do. Very much unlike their father Samuel. In chapter 12, Samuel describes what his own tenure as judge was like. In chapter 12, in verses 3 through 5, he says, "Here I am. Bear witness against me before the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? I will restore it to you." They said, "You have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand." He said to them, "The Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day that you have found nothing in my hand." And they said, "He is witness." Samuel's sons were not like he was. They did not live up to his way of doing things. They are undeserving of their names, Abijah and Joel. Joel meaning Yahweh is God, Abijah meaning Yahweh is my father. And yes, it does remind us of Eli. Just as Eli failed to raise his sons right, Samuel is now going to suffer consequences for the same failure. And the nation, well, the nation has a response to this as well. Somebody read verses 4 through 9 of chapter 8 of 1 Samuel.
All the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel, and they said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel, that give us a king to judge us. Samuel prayed unto Jehovah, and Jehovah said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people, all that they say unto thee. They have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not. According to all the works which they have done, since the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day. From that day they have forsaken me, and served other gods. So do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice. Howbeit, thou shalt protest solemnly unto them, and shalt show them the manner of the king that will reign over them.
All right. What are Israel's reasons? Why do they want a king? What are their reasons for that?
Well, the reason for Samuel are good reasons. Because his sons
Okay.
had
They do have a valid point in that Samuel's sons are definitely corrupt and, perverted in justice. And, they point out the fact, Samuel, you're old now. You can't do this forever. That's most people tend to die when they get to a certain age. Samuel's sons are corrupt. What other reason do they give? And there's one that's stated twice in this chapter. One, we haven't read the one in verse 20 yet, but yes. We want to be like the other nations.
Everybody else gets to do it.
Everybody else gets to do it, right? Yeah, that's basically what this is, isn't it? Okay, and later on in verse 20, they cite another reason. All right, we want him to judge us, and we want him to fight our battles for us. Now, actually, when we get to chapter 12, we learn more specific information about what's going on here. In verse 12, it says that when you saw Nahash, the king of the sons of Ammon, came against you, you said to me, No, but a king shall reign over us, although the Lord your God was your king. So Nahash the Ammonite has not been he doesn't get mentioned until chapter 11, but he is kind of looming in the background here. Mark.
So we've got two guys here that are only authorities over our religious life. They're not doing the right thing. So we want an absolute authoritarian figure to completely control our lives, and we don't expect him to be just as bad as your son.
Well, we're going to evaluate this as we go and try to sort out the good from the bad. Now, not all, and I think a valid point was made. Not all of Israel's reasons for wanting a king are necessarily bad. They are correct to identify a problem of faulty leadership, and their solution is let's imitate the nations because that's worked so well before. What was the book of Judges about? It's the same cycle over and over. But when we were discussing the book of Judges, what was the thing I kept repeating was the main theme of the book? They were just like the Canaanites. They wanted to be like everybody else. They served the same gods as the people who were living in the land that they were in. They adopted the same practices. By the end of the book of Judges, Israel is completely indistinguishable from the Canaanites they sought to destroy. Imitating the nations drove them to the point of having no glory, no tabernacle, and so many other things gone wrong. And now, just when they've kind of gotten out of that mess, they say, hey, let's do something else like the nations. So, they got it figured out, right? Well, and of course, therein we have a problem. And Samuel is naturally displeased with this. Why is Samuel so upset about this? He knows it's not God's way. He does seem to kind of take it personally, I think. And God kind of corrects him a little bit, I think. listen to the voice of the people. They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me. Why would Samuel take something personally like this? Yeah. They rejected him. They didn't just reject him. They rejected daddy's boys. Something a little odd here. Was the office of a judge hereditary? No, it was not. So, how do we explain how Samuel's son got into power? Nepotism? What? Yeah, that's right. Samuel is not, I don't think Samuel's completely blameless in this story. He appoints his sons as judges in spite of the fact that a judge is not a hereditary office. He creates a nepotistic monarchy in function. Now, we're not going to call it a monarchy. We're not going to call them kings. But, it's kind of like Gideon. Gideon says, I'm not going to be your king. But then he proceeds to go around living like a king and setting up his sons as rulers after him and all of those types of things as well. Now, the Lord, God, gives a little different opinion. What is God's opinion of this matter? Let them have their way, but why? Now, they haven't rejected you, Sam.
God's going to give them their way to teach them how their way is going to, what their way is going to lead them into. It's kind of like, when I've heard kids say, my mom caught me smoking a cigarette out back in the barn. She made me smoke the entire pack, and I never wanted another cigarette in my life. If you want to smoke a cigarette, you do the whole pack right in front of me. I'll give you.
Yeah, there is some precedence in that, I guess. There is some similarity to this as well to what happens in Numbers 14, for instance. The people, they spy out the land, and they find out, we can't take the land. They're too powerful for us. Let's get rid of Moses, appoint a new leader, and go back to Egypt. And in Numbers chapter 14, in verse 4, they say, let's appoint a leader and go back to Egypt. But the Lord, He comes in and He says, this people, how long will this people spurn me? They're not rejecting Moses, they're rejecting me. They're testing the Lord in this particular instance. And the Israel's saying, we wish we could have died in the wilderness. Okay, you get your wish. You're going to die in the wilderness. Go ahead. God gives people what they ask for. And Israel, they reject Samuel, the prophet like Moses, but they're really rejecting the Lord from being king over them.
But also, asked when they demanded meat instead of just manna, God gave them quail until it came out their nostrils.
Yeah, that's true. He gave them what they asked for. God does that. He'll give people what they ask for sometimes, just to show them how miserable it's really going to make them. And Israel, they want a human king like the nations. Keith, you got something? Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, God frequently does that, and this is one of those instances, which I guess kind of answers question 3 and 4. Why does God instruct Samuel to concede to the people's demands? God equates their request with all the other sins of the past. They've been doing this since Egypt. Just as they took Yahweh to serve other gods, now they're forsaking Yahweh to go find another king. Now, they didn't set up an idol or a Baal in this particular instance. They don't really start worshiping the false gods again until the time of Solomon. But for now, we see that the Lord is being rejected in another capacity altogether. And, well, God basically says, tell the people what to expect. Tell them about the procedure of the king. That brings us to verse 10. Somebody read verse 10 to the end of the chapter. Okay. Now, what would we say? What kinds of things is the king of Israel going to do? He's going to fight their battles, all right. Selfish, self-centered. Your taxes are going to go up. He's going to be. Children are going to be drafted. He's going to be pro-big government, all those wonderful things that we're just, so loving here. He's going to take their sons and draft them, make their daughters his perfumers, his cooks, and his bakers. There's actually an argument out there that the word perfumers should be translated concubines. I'll let you do with that what you will. He will tax their farmlands, their produce, their slaves, their donkeys, their flocks. To summarize, verse 18, you're not going to like it. You're going to cry out to the Lord, and the Lord's not going to answer you. But in verse 19, of course, the people refuse to listen. They refuse to hear, and because they refuse to hear here, God will refuse to hear them later. They are asking for a king. There's kind of a funny little wordplay going on. The Hebrew term for ask is sha'al, and Saul's name means the asked one, the requested one. They literally get the king they asked for. It's a kind of I just can't help but wonder if the writer had a little bit of a sense of humor about that. They literally get the king they requested because he is the requested one. Now, everybody already knows Samuel could see into the future. That's kind of been an established point since chapter 3. So when he tells people, you're going to hate this king in the long run, you're going to be miserable, and you're going to cry out for help, and no one's going to help you. We're going to not listen to you, Samuel. We're going to do this anyway. Sure, you're going to regret it. Let me ask you another question. Where do we see these actual events explicitly fulfilled in the Bible's history? Yeah, mostly under Solomon. Now, there is one instance recorded in the case of Saul where Saul recruits David to be a servant in his house in 1 Samuel 18 and verse 2, and he does not allow him to return to the house of his father. But in general, just from what we know of history and from what we can tell from the Bible, Saul probably wasn't a very powerful or wealthy first king of Israel. I guess he was a trendsetter in some ways, but I was talking to somebody actually who's done a little archaeological work in a place that they think might have belonged to Saul, and says it's a rather modest royal residence compared to some of the ancient Near Eastern rulers. The Bible never mentions Saul going anywhere north of the Jezreel Valley, which I think is interesting. His territorial control doesn't really extend into the northern tribes of Israel, it seems like. But David gets some chariots in his time, and Absalom is the first one we read about getting guys to actually run in front of his chariots in 2 Samuel 15. But it is Solomon, it is in Solomon's time that we see heavy taxation on the tribes of Israel, a huge provision for the king's daily meal, paid for out of the nation's pockets, 40,000 stalls for horses, 12,000 horsemen, and many chariots, substantial amounts of wheat and oil that... One thing that's interesting, Solomon trades wheat and oil, staple products of Israel. He taxes the farmlands and trades it off to Hiram, king of Tyre, so he can get cedar wood. What was that wood used for? It was used to build the temple, but it was also used to build his house. Here's a question, trivia question. Which house was more expensive? The temple or Solomon's palace? Solomon's palace was twice as large, took twice as long to build. I mean, it's almost twice as long to build. You know, everything about Solomon's palace is even more lavish than the temple he constructed. And I mean, the temple's a pretty lavish building. So, I mean, do with that what you will. Mark, do you have something?
I was just wondering, in verse 15, it says that he will take the tenth of your seed. That was casual part about maybe they were grudging God tithe.
Hey, you gotta.
He's going to take you another tithe.
Yeah, you want to pay more tithes? Okay, go ahead. I mean, it's. You know, it is kind of sad how that works. And I wasn't even done reading the long list of stuff that Solomon did that would have been considered a breach of this kind of stuff. But all that to say, this doesn't really get fulfilled in Saul's time as much as it does later. But Samuel warned them ahead of time, long before he knew what. Samuel doesn't even really live to see these consequences here. But the people are insistent. They say, we don't care about the consequences. We want this. Our motives are explicitly stated. We want somebody to fight our battles for us. Never mind that Yahweh is already fighting their battles. In many ways, they've got a substitute fighting their battles. Does that sound like anything we've seen before in Samuel? Eli. You know, where else? Israel puts their trust in the wrong thing on the battlefield.
The ark.
Yeah, it was like the Ark of the Covenant all over again. You know, this time it's not the God. I mean, they trusted in the throne of God instead of the God who sits enthroned above the cherubim. Now they're trusting in a human king rather than in the divine king who actually has won their battles. The people think a king will give them success the way the ark did. They're more interested in what they can see than in what they can't see. What was that? And I know it works just as well as the ark, right? Now, to be fair, we're going to see Saul does have some initial success in his rule as a king, but that success really starts to unravel when we get to chapter 13. So, Saul wins some battles here, but eventually it starts to unravel when he himself demonstrates his lack of faithfulness. And so God gives Israel the go-ahead, just like Yahweh told Balaam, go to Balak, go ahead, that's what you want to do anyway. He does the same thing for Israel, although he does put the fear into them later on in chapter 12, remind them what they're doing is not completely right. Okay, here's kind of to think about some of these ideas, these latter questions on the handout, as far as what's so wrong with wanting a king. Obviously, hanging in the background of all of this is that statement in Judges 17 and in Judges 21 that in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, how does that change here?
Had a king.
Okay, so Israel now has a king, but what didn't change? Still doing what's right in their own eyes. So there you have that problem. The situation has stayed the same.
Or at least doing what's right in the king's eyes.
Well, yeah, I mean, the act of appointing a king is itself doing what's right in their own eyes. The law, what does the law say about appointing a king? Where does the law say that? Where does it say you are not to appoint a king in the law? Okay. No, the law does not forbid appointing a king. It tells them what to do with it. Yeah. Right. Eventually. Let's read that. When you enter the land which the Lord your... Sorry, I mentioned it on the handout, but Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20 give the kingly regulations for Israel. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Now, to Israel's credit, they never did that. They never set a foreigner over themselves during the time of their monarchy. Maybe later on at some point they were ruled by the nations, but they didn't have a lot of choice in that. Verse 16, moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away Nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Tell you, it's like we're reading Solomon's biography here. Now it shall come about, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of the law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of the law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in the kingdom in the midst of Israel. You may be the most busiest administrator in the whole land of Israel, but you still have to study your Bible. There's an important point there as well. They knew all these rules. Now, this brings us to another sticky question. Was it inherently wrong for Israel to want a king, or was their motive simply what's wrong here? It's their motive that's wrong.
Well, I think it was wrong. Moses did not give them permission to do that. They acted outside of Moses told them to set judges over them. Then he kind of said, I know you're going to set a king over just like all the nations. I think the way Moses said that, there's implicit statement. God doesn't want that to happen.
Wow, it looks like we have a disagreement. Huh? Okay, all right, yeah, God was a king. Is there any place in the Bible where God speaks of the idea of Israel someday having a human king and in a positive way? Yes. Did anybody think of any places? Because there are a few. Oh, spiritual king. Oh. Well, we might think of Genesis chapter 17 and verse 6, the promise to Abraham. One of the promises made to Abraham is, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and your descendants after you. Verse 16 of the same chapter, speaking of Sarah, he says, I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. We might think of Genesis 49:10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from beneath his feet, until Shiloh comes. We might think of Balaam's prophecy that a star and a scepter would arise from Israel to crush Moab. And even the early part of Samuel. The early part of Samuel describes a king. This is not the first time a king has been mentioned in the book of 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 10, it says that the Lord will judge, starting at the beginning of verse 10, those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and will exalt the horn of his anointed. Now, on the one hand, you've got God promising human kings for Israel. On the other hand, you also have a number of affirmations in the Bible that God himself is their king. Exodus chapter 15 and verse 18, the Lord shall reign forever and ever. Deuteronomy 33:5, he was king among them in Jeshurun. The Psalms frequently talk about the idea that the Lord has always been king. So we've got God setting up a human king on one hand, and we've got God himself being king on the other hand. Now, of course, this paradox is ultimately resolved in Jesus. Thank you. Yes. The answer is always Jesus, who is both human king and divine king of kings. And at the same time, I do think that it's hard to resist this idea that God never intended for Israel to have a human king. The problem is not the request for king itself. I think it's hard to chalk up a lot of these promises to simply, God just permitted that out of the hardness of their hearts. That's said about divorce, but that doesn't really seem to be the idea here. The New Testament has a much more positive idea of what it means for God to give a king to his people. The problem is not the king himself. The problem is Israel's motive. And their motive is, we want to be like the nations. And God says, I don't want to give you a king like the nations. I want to give you a king that is totally unlike the nations. A king that is totally against everything that the nations stand for. When Samuel goes out to anoint David, what does he tell him? What does he tell them? Does he tell them, look at the... Serve God. Well, when he goes out to anoint David, well, more importantly, Samuel goes out to the house of Jesse. He's looking for a guy to anoint as king. He sees Jesse's firstborn son come out. Oh, surely the Lord has chosen him. What does the Lord say? No, the Lord has rejected him. Why? Because the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That's the point here. The problem with Israel is that they want to be like the nations. God has a plan to bring a king into the picture that will make them unlike the nations. He chooses David, somebody who's not great in stature at all, somebody who's totally contrary, the epitome of human foolishness. And it's David, not Saul, who becomes the great trendsetter for kings. Now, the events of this chapter also foreshadow Jesus. How does this chapter foreshadow Jesus? What kind of king was Israel looking for in the day of Jesus? Another. There's a star. Yeah. They're still looking for a king like the nations to fight their battles in the time of Jesus, aren't they? And Jesus comes forward, and He is not the Messiah they're expecting. He is not the guy that they're looking for. He's not the king they've been asking for. And yet, He is the king that they so desperately need for themselves. So when Pilate finally portrays Jesus as king, dresses Him in a purple robe, a crown of thorns, the whole mockery of the situation, he says, "Behold your king," in allusion to Zechariah 6. And the people say what?
We have no king but Caesar.
We have no king but Caesar. Give us a king, just not him. We want somebody else. Now, of course, their loyalty to Caesar is ultimately questionable. But the point is, ultimately still the same. They have been rejecting God as king, and they continue to reject God as king. And when Pilate's question drips with horrific irony, "Shall I crucify your king?" That's the last place a king should be, is crucified. And yet, in spite of the crucifixion, the kingdom of God, the rule of God was established. Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so, that kind of just brings it around full circle there. Are there any ways in which we as Christians might say today, appoint us for us a king to judge us like all the nations?
Write out a check.
Yeah. Let other people do the work. Write out the check. Okay, what else? That's an open-ended question. I'm not looking for something specific, but
Pastor system. Preacher becomes de facto head of the local congregation. Run everything, do everything, and answer all the questions. I've seen that.
Right, okay. You see it? Well, yeah, I think it's manifested. There's a classic lesson here about the difference between imitating worldly wisdom and imitating the wisdom of God. When 3 John 11 tells us, "Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but imitate what is good." As far as the world is concerned, which is more popular? God's wisdom or man's wisdom? Well, man's wisdom is more popular, but that doesn't make it right. Worldly wisdom gets nullified by the cross of Jesus Christ. So when, Paul said that God had made foolish the wisdom of the world, he was in the cross. He was talking about this whole cutting against the grain of what mankind considers big and flashy and prominent and special. Israel's entire identity is not bound up in their being like the nations. It's bound up in them being distinct from the nations. In Leviticus 20, God told them, "I set you apart from the peoples to be mine. You shall be holy, for I am holy." In Deuteronomy 4, He says, "What nation is there like Israel that I've brought out with great signs and wonders to do this? And what nation is there who has such laws and statutes as which I am giving you today?" Their whole pride and joy is in their distinctness. And yet, Israel says, no, we want to be more like the nations. We want to be more like everybody else. We're not interested in distinctness. We follow the Lord's instructions. when we're thinking about a local congregation like this one, do we follow the Lord's way of doing things for how it should function, or do we, let's figure out what everybody else is doing to get people in the door. Let's make ourselves popular. Popularity and numbers is not necessarily a measure of a congregation's health. It can be, but it's not necessarily that. Manifested in the way we think about our lives. Do we do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, or do we follow the example of our peers like they know what they're talking about? Well, do we think the world has something better to offer than God does? Those are, I think, some compelling questions we need to ask, lest we make the statement, give us a king to judge us like all the nations. All right, anybody else got anything on chapter 8? We're not quite done. I'm going to get in chapter 9 if there's nothing else. But chapter 9. Okay, chapter 9 we introduce Saul to the story. And just read the first couple verses for a minute. Somebody read the first 2 verses.
Now there was a man in Benjamin, son of Decorah, the son of a mighty man, had a son, Saul, out of shoulders enough.
What's the first thing we learn about Saul? He is a good-looking dude. He is is this the kind of guy you want to make your king?
Well, of course.
It's what the world's looking for. It's what Israel's looking for. They said, give us a king to... Israel does not hold an election for their king. God picks their king for them. And He picks somebody that they would think would be king. That's the interesting thing about this. God's the one that picks Saul for this task. And then Saul is the one who wreaks havoc on it. I think the Lord knows ahead of time what Saul's going to do. He picks Saul to show them the folly of the wisdom of the world. That's the problem. He says, you think that this is going to be a good king. Let me show you what happens when you put this guy in charge. Let me show you what happens when you put your picture-perfect king in charge of the nation. They want the king to go fight our battles? So God gives them a battle fighter. It's funny. Is Saul the tallest person in the Bible? Goliath is taller than him, right?
I'm sure who's the tallest.
I don't know who the tallest man in the Bible is either, but Goliath would be a top contender for that.
Peter was the shortest.
Yeah, that's true. Well, no, it's Nehemiah, Bildad the Shuhite, and then Peter. So it's but no, Goliath is taller than Saul. And so what does Saul do when Goliath shows up to fight? Get somebody else to do this, because that's where human wisdom gets you. You're the biggest bully on the block, and that makes you the best until a bigger bully comes along. The story of David and Goliath is really the story of David versus Goliath is really the story of David versus Saul. Because, Goliath, the outcome is already determined. Whoever gets out and fights him is going to kill him because he's blaspheming the Lord. But it is Saul who should have gone out and fought him, and Saul didn't. Saul, who was supposed to lead them in battle because of his great strength, but he didn't do it. Because David, and David, who nobody would have guessed would be the king, nobody would have picked from the human perspective, goes out and wins the battle and becomes king as a result of that. The people have the wrong criteria for a king, and God will show them that. Oh boy, and we have 1 minute left. Anybody got anything they want to add in that last minute? He was picked because of his genealogy? Okay. I guess, and this raises some interesting questions. What do we know about Benjamin from recent history of Israel? Have they been the real spiritual go-getters in this nation?
Yeah.
And go back to Judges 19, 20, and 21, that whole mess at Gibeah. By the way, what was the name of Saul's hometown? Gibeah, yeah. Which, it's been rebuilt by this point. All the original inhabitants are dead, so it's not exactly that way. But it is interesting to me that Saul comes from the town of Gibeah, and his first victory is at Jabesh Gilead, the other town that gets destroyed in Judges 21. So those are all kind of interesting little details to keep a lookout for. All right, we're going to try to get through chapter 10 next time. And I appreciate the comments and the discussion, and I will pick up and finish chapters 9 and 10 next time.